All right, we are here again with another live stream, and today we are excited to have Jeremiah Harding with us. And I'll go ahead and let Jeremiah introduce himself and let everyone know who he is. So, Jeremiah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jeremiah Harding, or Insanity is Free, and you can probably find me using Google by either of those. Because apparently I'm number one Jeremiah Harding, so that's kind of nice. I think the previous one was like a soccer player or something. Um, but so I do live streams pretty regularly. I do one every morning at 11 a.m. Eastern time on my channel Jeremiah Talks, which is available at youtube.com/Jeremiah Talks. I also do on the same channel a thing every Wednesday I call Real News Wednesday, which is a 3-hour live stream of the news that has happened since the previous Wednesday. And also, I do a topic every Sunday on something I call Shit Shooting Sunday for 3 hours in the same time frame. And the time frame on both Sunday and Wednesday is 6 to 9 p.m. Eastern time. I also do a radio show, an online radio show called Moment of Rage with Jeremiah Harding. And that's available on journalisticrevolution.com, ipmnation.com, and airadio.com. I think that's what those places that place is called. I just got syndicated to AI Radio, so I think that's what they're called, but like don't quote me. You can find it though. Like just Google Moment of Rage. In fact, AI Radio is the one that made it a podcast, so you could probably just find it by that. I also post on Steam it. I'm primarily on Twitter though, and Facebook secondarily. So you can find me at all of those places. I'm an angry, pessimistic libertarian anarchist, and I'm here to make everybody's time worse because I think the state likes to keep people nice and pacified.
So, what is it about the state that makes you so angry?
I mean, I'm okay. So something everybody should know is that I have this type of bipolarism that makes me kind of like angry all the time, anyway. But then like the fact that the state encroaches on people's liberty by default and then asks them to justify this crime um, is something that's, severely irritating at the least. And then the fact that they encroach on people's liberties in very specific ways and have learned to control the entire world's minds, have them by the heartstrings and the brain neurons. The fact that essentially they've cowed the world into submission and turned the entire thing into a tax farm of complacent cattle. That makes me angry for some reason.
How did you, I guess, wake up to this whole idea? Because I know a lot of people aren't like they don't grow up like this, you know?
Yeah, well, I was a hippie when I was a really young kid. Like I was a Sierra Club member. I walked up mountains with my grandmother. Um, and so I was a hippie, but then I sort of like started to see a lot of the problems with my hippie mindset. So I swung sort of the other way and became a neocon. And I was a neocon pretty much my entire high school years until I realized how dumb that was. And then I slowly started to learn about libertarianism because my mother introduced me to the concept when I was talking about like what I was going to be when I got to voting age, because she said I didn't sound like either a Republican or a Democrat, and I said, yeah, no, I don't. And this was back when I was still trying to cleanse my reputation from having been quotable as saying, Bush did nothing wrong and we should glass Iran. So I was pretty much a dumb kid, and but a dumb kid with like ethics, and a dumb kid in terms of like those ethics and how to properly apply them. And I was also a Christian in the very loosest of terms, basically a Christian in name only, not there for the philosophy, not there for the non-aggression inherent in the Christian mindset if you actually follow Christ. Um, and I decided that the ideas espoused by the Libertarian Party seemed reasonable, and much more reasonable than the ideas espoused by the Republicans or Democrats, because I was starting to realize from a very young age that neither of those parties really made sense. And then gradually I started to get more and more involved in anarchist circles until I realized that I had to pretty much check my ethics, because I had developed a lot of, very strong ethical stances to go along with my libertarianism, but I hadn't really ever cemented them. And in a lot of ways, I decided that I had to put myself through a crucible. So I watched like hours of police brutality videos for like 2 weeks or something. It was something insane like that. Police brutality, war videos, and I sort of had to rack my conscience to justify supporting that at all. And I realized I didn't support it. I didn't support government by default. I just supported some of the services that they provided. And I realized that those services could be provided by anyone else, and that not only can they, but should they. So they were, it was a relatively ethics-based conclusion, but based in some sort of rationality. Like, I was there in a very tactile way to try and figure out the solutions to these problems that exist in the most ethical way, and I found out government wasn't that. And then ever since then, I've just been going deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole and figuring out more and more about how the government is not only unethical by design, but unethical in practice and in execution. And I've realized they're a gang of thieves. They're scumbag criminals. It's a giant cartel that spans the entire globe, a business that tries to protect its business interests at the expense of human liberty. And they're treating us all like brainwashed tax cattle, because until you start to think in a similar way to this, you are one. So I sort of, it's been a long journey of the past basically like 15 years. But now I'm here. If that answers your question. I think it might have been a really long, drawn out way of saying it, though.
It's like the whole timeline.
Yeah, pretty much. Was there any specific moments throughout that time, other than your watching of police brutality videos, that kind of pushed you over the edge?
I would say a lot of the stuff involving things like WikiLeaks. The Ron Paul campaign was a really big eye-opener, because back when I still supported the minarchist message, which was essentially like, we might still be able to fix this from the inside without resorting to violence or any sort of external revolution. I was a big Ron Paul supporter. I loved his messages. I thought that they were on point and delivered from a much more Christian perspective than many of the supposed Christians out there. And this was, while I was atheist. So, it was really nice to see somebody that was an authentic Christian, because I certainly wasn't during my latter years. I was a real asshole. But beyond all that, to see him get the shaft at the RNC was a real eye opener for me. And then once he got the shaft and I realized politics was basically bullshit, I was doing a lot of campaigning at the time for Young Americans for Liberty. And I slowly started to realize that this institution was corporatist, that a lot of these institutions that claim to be libertarian held up a statist or a state figure as their most libertarian example, rather than citing Rothbard, rather than citing any of these great thinkers that Ron Paul would cite. They were citing Ron Paul at the top of their libertarian chart. And I thought, that's strange. And then they had us campaigning for Rand Paul and all of these other right-wing people. And, no left-wingers. God, no. We could never have that in an organization that's theoretically supposed to be centrist.
Right.
But it really opened my eyes to the fact that there could be snakes in every patch of grass. And I realized, and I was always a pessimist and a cynic. I always sort of looked for the worst in people, blame childhood trauma, blame the fact that I've had night terrors since I was 4, blame my overactive metabolism or imagination or whatever. But I've always looked at the hardest parts of people and the parts of people that were the most sick and devious as their primary traits, because generally that's proven itself to be true. And so, I've always sort of looked at things that way. But then to see that even people who supposedly called themselves liberty lovers, a lot of the time were just there to campaign for one politician or another who wasn't actually going to fundamentally change anything, and to realize that politics itself was a scam where only occasional concessions came out in favor of the people. Essentially, it was a crucible in its own right. And I realized that a lot of the things that I was supporting in terms of politics needed to go. And eventually that became politics needed to go. If that answers your question.
Well, if things are replaced, then what's going to replace it?
Well, okay. So this is a complicated question that, I'm actually writing a book on.
Oh, wow.
Nice.
But you actually touched on one of the aspects of it in a hashtag you used that I coined, and that hashtag is AnarchoCoalitionism.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of infighting among people who supposedly call themselves anarchists. A lot of this infighting amounts to various sorts of threats of physical violence, various ways of insulting one another, various ways of essentially proving to the outside world that anarchy is a group of crazy people. And I saw that this was hugely ineffective. Now, as a person raised Christian, I got real used to thinking of the end times. I got real used to thinking of everything is going to end in real bad ways. And I've had nightmares since before I even knew about Revelations or any of the seedier parts of the Bible that looked like Revelations before I even read Revelations, which is why Revelations seemed so real to me when I was a Christian. But those nightmares sort of seem like premonitions now, because for, you know, my whole life, as far as I can remember, I've had sick dreams of death and destruction and imprisonment and terror and tyranny, and all of these sorts of things have sort of culminated in my current terrible attitude, because, you know, I can't even go to sleep to relax. I fucking, it's there even when I'm asleep. So the fact that I've always been angry has contributed to this in a great deal of ways. But when you start to look at these people fighting amongst each other and making the essentially the much more peaceful alternative seem like a group of violent people on any side you look at, seem like a group of people who are not there for personal liberty, but there for personal gain, it makes the whole thing seem like a scam. And it makes the outside less willing to talk to us, much less to change their mind. Additionally, it makes mutual anarchists consider each other enemies. And in dividing our power, it's basically playing directly into the hands of the global elites, which I don't know if y'all are familiar with it, but they're a huge, there's a small cluster of a huge amount of people running things, and they aren't the people that are, quote, elected, or as I like to say, selected. Those people are running things in the background, and they love the people fighting each other. They love watching us pretend like we're better than one another, while the people who are really running the system say, yeah, well, they all suck, and they're all playing right into our hands. And I see people dying. I see people being imprisoned. I see people having the fuck beaten out of them by cops, and, you know, being deformed by depleted uranium that the US government swears and promises sincerely it doesn't use. And I see all of this shit, like all of this, like, blood raining down from the sky, and I realize that anarchists aren't stemming the flow, they're adding to it, in many ways, because they're not willing to work with one another, because they make it look like, if you're a capitalist, we're going to gulag you, or, you know, send you out to the firing squad, or etc., etc. And if you're a communist, we're going to throw you out of a helicopter or into a wood chipper, rather than realizing that the final economic product is a marketplace of ideas just like any other, and it should be allowed to compete. Many of these people have chosen that they're not even going to let these ideas compete. They're just going to insult and threaten each other in place of any genuine conversation. And this takes place a huge amount also in the universities, where essentially they have decided on the left pretty collectively to not allow certain people a platform. And the right would do a similar thing, but they have the platform right now, so they don't need to worry about that. And in many ways, they're trying to do that. Like the fake news is the English and modern way of saying Lügenpresse, and that's a German term for lying media. And it was popularized during the rise of Nazi Germany. So all the hallmarks of fascism are coming out, while people are arguing about which form of anarchy should be allowed to live, literally, not killed. And people are going to die because there just aren't that many anarchists. And a lot of them aren't willing enough to work with each other to actually come to a solution there, and are so well vested in their own idea of a proper economy, that they don't want actual progress badly enough to stick a sock in it for a moment, to be humble and listen to somebody who they might disagree with. A lot of them block each other. A lot of them just threaten each other or insult each other in the ways that I've already said. And I want that to stop. And so the first step is going to be anarchists being willing to have adult conversations about every topic that's remotely affiliated with the state right now. Everything that's remotely connected to the state needs to be taken over by anarchists or abolished entirely. And if anarchists realize the necessity here, the dire need for a better paradigm, even in their own rhetoric, then we could possibly win. But right now we can't even talk about it, much less win. We can't strategize, much less win. And so the first step is going to be forming coalitions with people willing to go with us until they're not. Essentially, the enemy of your enemy is not necessarily your friend, but they're also not necessarily your enemy as well. And you need to take it on a case-by-case basis and work with people who you might not 100 or even 90% agree with. And that's the first step, because without communication, there can be no zeitgeist of ideas, and there can be no positive steps towards anarchy.
Right.
And then the second step, effectively, is trying to find ways to move away from government in all industries. And that's going to be a decentralization effort. It's going to be a localization effort. And it's going to be an intense and rigorous process that's probably going to be demolished by the state. I'm a pessimist. I don't think we're actually going to succeed here. But I think not trying is what's going to stop us, not succeeding. If we at least try, we can say we did our best and it didn't come out. But if we don't do anything and we just resign ourselves to petty disputes on the internet, nothing's going to change. So my response, I guess, would be do what Domino's is doing. If you're a business and you see something wrong, bankroll the solution. Be the solution to the problems. Be the change you want to see in the world, or in this case, the potholes to prevent pizza damage. And there are many sorts of applications of this methodology of thought, many of which you can read in works like, I forget what the thing was, but it's The Nature of Property by Proudhon, I believe it was. Lysander Spooner's The No Treason series. The Machinery of Freedom by David Friedman. Freedom by Kokesh. All of these are great things to read, but also just networking in general, finding people in your local community. I mean, Phil Robertson of Duck Dynasty recently, February or something, came out and said, if the government shuts down, I hope they just keep it that way. And I'm with him on that. If you watch the whole video, of course, he wants government for police and military, but, that's a separate subject, and I'm sure we could have a few conversations over a few strong drinks, whether or not that was necessary. But reasonably speaking, I think that the first step is going to be talking amongst one another and having those civil conversations.
It is interesting. You were just talking about Phil Robertson, how, if the government shut down, then he's all for it. But when it comes to the military and police, we need to have that.
It seems to be like the conservative thing. Don't you
Yeah.
think?
They're very pro-military and pro-police, and then the liberals are more, social programs, like education, healthcare, all that kind of stuff. So they're for government programs, but just different ones.
Right. Well, and of course, they don't really see the police and military in backwoods, so that would be one of my first things I would bring up to him if I was having that conversation. You don't really see the police and military in the backwoods, so you don't know how much they're encroaching on individual liberty as we speak, so you don't see them as fundamentally a similar threat. And I'd probably approach it that way because effectively they've become a standing army, and any constitutionalist, any God-loving person, as he kept on calling himself, needs to realize that that's not okay. So.
Well, say, for example, the police and the military is completely abolished and they get rid of that. So what would take its place? Because I know we're just talking about replacing things, but would it just be the people being their own army, or?
Yeah, a lot of people bring that point up when I say something about it. They're like, "Well, then who's gonna defend us? Then you're gonna defend yourself by yourself with your own gun?" I'm like, I don't know what to say to that.
Yeah.
All right, so there are a few responses to that. First, this is going to need to be a global paradigm shift. If it's not a global paradigm shift, then we'll build up in our tiny little postage stamp on the map and be completely obliterated by a state force that decides to take over. Or just like cut off from trade or something because we've expressed a hostility toward their, politics, and they've decided to put sanctions on any sorts of goods that move through there. So it's going to need to be a global paradigm shift, and it's probably not going to happen. Like I said, I'm a pessimist. I don't think it's going to happen, but I might be wrong, and I'd be glad to be proven wrong. In fact, like that would be one of the best things to happen in my life if I was proven wrong on that. But I think it's going to take a really long time for that global paradigm shift to happen. And there are many approaches to that global paradigm shift that I tried to address on my YouTube channel. But then I'm also going to try and address in very specific videos I've got coming out. I'm also going to discuss elements of that paradigm shift that could be happening every day on Instagram TV. I'm going to start my Instagram TV series next week. But and you can find that at Insanity is Free on Instagram. It'll just be like an Instagram video, and like through the Instagram video thing section, whatever. But effectively, the global paradigm shift is going to be necessary. We're going to need to find ways to get the entire world off the drug that is government. And the second thing is that government is a monopoly on force. And in doing so, in being a monopoly on force, they have all of the weapons that are of any tactical value. And we have pretty much none of them. There's still guerrilla war, but that's a war of attrition, and most people don't want to just keep on throwing family members and friends at the enemy until the enemy throws up their hands and says, well, we give up. So that part of it will need to be like sort of decentralized military hardware. Everything that the military has will need to be redistributed to the public, and maybe sold directly to militias or other sorts of paramilitary institutions, which would effectively become the military. And this sort of thing would have to happen over a gradual period. There would have to be a gradual transfer of all of the base lands around the world back to their respective countries. And all of this sort of thing would have a general drawdown of tensions to begin with. I don't know how it would work long term because I'm not sure that this could even last if it did get established, because people fucking suck.
Yeah,
but if what?
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna ask you because it kind of reminded me of something we were talking about earlier. Do you think that in order for that like paradigm to shift, that there would have to be like some outbreak of violence? Like this kind of like the circle of violence, and that's how we start.
It wouldn't have to be, but I think that's inevitable. I like. I'm not gonna say like I know for 100% certain. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't look into the future and say, wow, gee, that actually did happen peacefully. I hope it does. I really fucking do. Because if it does, that means that somehow the message of peace and liberty and prosperity permeated the minds of all of these statist sheep, or enough of them that the other ones shut the fuck up. But if not, there's going to be a huge amount of recalcitrance to this change. And a whole bunch of people are going to be very violently and vehemently against it. And they're going to use force to try and stop peaceful anarchists from doing their peaceful anarchy. So it wouldn't surprise me if there was violence, and it would surprise me if there wasn't, to be as generous as possible as I can toward the human race.
Yeah, it's kind of hard when you're not like, there's like a concept that humans are selfish, right? So it's kind of like that seems like it would happen anyway. It doesn't matter like what ideology anyone has, but eventually it would lead to violence, like a circle of violence, and then come back to peace.
Well, right. And, you know, I think a large amount of this problem is it results back to something that I bring up regularly on my social media and in my videos, which is the fact that people don't consider the consequences of their actions, and they're always deferring them to a third party, whether that be government or a corporation or something else. And as a result, they make really, truly irresponsible decisions that end up with god-awful consequences that people then demand this third party clean up. One of the great examples I use of this is responsible fucking. And this is something that gets me called a eugenicist semi-regularly, but I don't give a fuck. I stopped caring a really long time ago. Because if you fuck and you produce a child that you weren't prepared for, and then suddenly you have this child that you took to term and had and everything, if you do that, you will have this child that you don't have the material resources, the networking, the family, the local neighborhood sort of web setup, or anything else to properly care for. And as a result, you're going to have this kid babysat by a bunch of institutions that aren't you, not the least of which in the modern day is devices. Devices that so happen to be tethered to the statist mindset in many ways. And in this particular case, you set your child down in front of the television or something similar, and your child then has this infinite entertainment and no real consequence for any sort of thing that happens on the screen. So they constantly go back to that to get their dopamine rush and to feel like they're a part of something, because parents aren't there for their children anymore. Because parents get schools to tell their children how to think. Because parents are increasingly feminized, and effectively they're not allowed to have a father figure in the first place, much less a father figure that is strong and masculine, because masculinity is, of course, toxic now. So we have the state being the patriarch of the household. And in doing so, in having this societal structure, it's no longer dad going out and solving problems. It's the local policeman, the officer friendly, the constant propaganda going through school where you've got the cartoon character smiling officer with a cute little badge and no gun on his person. And the kid's supposed to trust the state, which that officer emblematizes, because keep in mind, kids impression their minds on reference points that they receive at the earliest ages. So the more impressionable they are, the younger they are, and vice versa. And so they start to think of the state as their preventer of safety, security, resources, comfort, and everything else. And they start to become more and more distant from their family. They start to rebel. And their parents don't, because they're neglectful and they weren't there with their kid while their kid was figuring this stuff out. They don't think of that in a way that they had anything to do with it. They think of it in a way that the child is being a brat or disobedient, or they're ADHD and they need pills, you know. And so we have a society of drugged out psychopathic kids who aren't listened to by the people who should listen to them, and are listened to and indoctrinated by the people they should not have heard from in the first place. And as a result, a huge amount of societal malaise, discomfort, anger, resentment, and strife comes out of that. And to try and make it seem like the people who've been there for the kids in a much more concrete way than most parents have, which would, of course, in this case be the government, are somehow evil or an institution not worth having, it's a really tough ask to ask somebody to change their entire mentality on. And that's going to, paint, it's going to color the entire future of political discourse in terms of how people interface with the world. But, if we want a positive future, one of the, key steps is not to fuck at all, even with the most protection, if you can't afford children, and to try and get into a place so that you can fuck at any point and still be able to afford whatever child comes out of that. So that you can then properly care for your child, not with resentment, but with the best possible outcome. And as a result, I hope the people that are good at this, the people that can like maneuver around that that minefield of possibilities the best, the most ethical and reasonable people out there, I hope those people breed and have more than 5 children, because then they can start the process of outpacing the breeding of the unethical and unintelligent people out there who have chosen to make the world their dumping ground for all of their problems of deferred maintenance and irresponsibility.
It's kind of crazy how just that one thing kind of snowballs into everything else. And I don't think a lot of people think about it that way. I think a lot of people know that there's a problem. Like they know that there's problems, but they don't understand how it comes about. Like they blame it on other things.
They don't want to take responsibility.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and it's that thing there. They don't want to take responsibility for their neighborhood's defense. So they think, well, if this institution is there, then I won't have to take responsibility. I won't have to think about the security of my neighborhood. And whenever something comes up, I'll just call on this institution for help. And that compartmentalizes it in their brain. It puts it as something they don't have to think about, like breathing. And when you don't think about something like that, it allows whatever is involved in your community that would be an outside threat. Think of your community as an organism, and think of like these outside threats as a malignant cancer or a bacteria that is hostile to the current bacteria in the existing biome. If you don't have an active monitoring system, you can't make sure that these pathological things stay excluded from your society. And if you don't actively monitor it on a personal level, you can't make sure that your society stays clean. And as a result, people have fundamentally unclean societies, and they get very surprised whenever one of those uncleanlinesses suddenly manifests in a way that negatively impacts them, because they weren't thinking about it that way. They were thinking, as long as I pay my taxes, this community will stay quiet and nice and clean and well-kept. And they don't think about the fact that, you know, essentially they're throwing their money down holes. They're supporting unethical people joining these institutions so that they can use violence against people. They're supporting all of these sorts of mentalities that are fundamentally antithetical to a free social order. And in reason and evidence, all of these sorts of things have always led to tyrannies. Like the cliche that says the smallest governments lead to the biggest tyrannies is happening right here in America. They're considering banning handing out straws unsolicited, with thousands of dollars of fines and jail time if you deign to, you know, neglect that. And this sort of like thing comes out of the irresponsibility. It comes out of the fact that people don't consider what their actions will do, who they'll affect, or much less the fact that it affects them in a very negative way. Because if somebody offers you a solution and you aren't presented with a problem first, if you never have to face that hardship and see how rare it could be, you'll never realize the fact that there might be a better solution to that problem than the one that's always been presented to you. And most people are content to just say, well, without government, we wouldn't have X, Y, and Z, without considering the fact that those are universally preferred things that people would generally want outside of any sort of social paradigm. Security, safety, the ability to walk away from your home and consider it protected, all of these sorts of things, much less preservation from an outside force. And so if this paradigm shift happened on a global level, people would want to take more responsibility because they would realize its value. And they would realize that responsibility, taking that personal responsibility, even if it comes down to something as simple as I'm horny and I'm not going to do what MTV wants me to do, which is run by the global elite, and just fuck my way out of this situation. I'm horny, so I'll, you know, try and find some way to be constructive with the missus, so that she'll want to reward me with sex and that we can have kids that we can properly raise. There's all these sorts of maneuvers that somebody who's personally responsible takes into consideration that somebody who's not personally responsible learns that they don't have to. And as a result, all these evil people get to do this stuff and people don't have any mechanisms to stop them because they weren't responsible for them in the beginning, much less having any sort of contingency plan.
Yeah, and even like when you bring that up to someone, they get offended. Like if you bring up personal responsibility, just like for example with the responsible fucking thing, like if you bring that up to someone, they'll be like, "What? You don't believe in sexual liberation? Like what's wrong?" Right?
Sex feels really good. I want to do it as much as possible.
And
creating kids. That's what they say.
And there's the other part of it. When you allow a political movement to own a term or an idea or a general set of concepts, rather than allowing the idea to flow freely between multiples and see which one it meets itself out the best under, that allows for that sort of political movement to claim that anybody who's rejecting that idea rejects everything they associated that idea with. So if I'm talking about responsible fucking, they're going to call me a Puritan, and they've done it before, or a eugenicist, or something similar. I've been called a Nazi multiple times for suggesting that to people. And it's because people have associated these things in their mind with certain political philosophies. I can't be a liberal if I don't support the liberalization of sex, if I don't support spreading it around like it's an infinite resource rather than treating it like it's something that's going to produce another living sapient, sentient organism with rights, feelings, and emotions that will someday have a contribution to society, whether positive or negative. I won't consider how I can make that contribution positive or negative, because I won't even consider that thing could come out, which is why we have programs like Judge Judy, Maury, Springer, all these things, Dr. Phil, for essentially a society that has decided to abdicate responsibility for their actions to third parties. Instead of getting a DNA test yourself, well, shit, I want a DNA test, and I also want to be famous on TV, so I'll denigrate everybody I know by putting them through the Jerry Springer show, or Maury, or one of these fundamentally evil distraction mechanisms that so many people love because it reflects the sort of irresponsibility that they want to participate in and makes it seem okay. It normalizes it. So I'm actually not a, quote, sexual liberationist. I think that there are many ways to become satisfied with your place in the world that involve responsibility. And that if you use protection and you use it while you have the capability to have that kid and that protection works, well, then fantastic. You just had a great night. You probably had a few drinks. It was a fantastic experience, and you got laid, and you also have enough money that you can do it again tomorrow night, and keep on doing this and having a great, fun life. But if you don't have that money, then it's going to be a constant struggle to just get laid. And that should never be your mean. It should never be something that you aspire to essentially exist at the level you always have. Nobody wants to climb anymore. They've all been convinced that being normal should be okay, rather than trying to be extraordinary and be the best version of themselves they can be. They've accepted this doldrum life, this really sad life. And we wonder why there are so many issues with things like clinical depression, where people aren't treating their underlying conditions and instead sinking it into fucking or drugs or alcohol or, something like that. And not having a really good environment that was built for people who weren't ready for a really good environment to come out of those things too. So they keep on escaping into these things because they give them an instant dopamine release, and they're much better than accepting that the world around them is crumbling. Instead of dealing with these underlying problems, a lot of people have chosen to not deal with them and to make a lifestyle out of not dealing with them, which is one of the reasons that there are phrases like, don't tell me what to do, which is an order to, tell somebody what to say and effectively tell somebody what to do while also demanding separate treatment. So that's an irony on its own. But then once you realize that people aren't willing to be accountable, and that fundamentally they're not even willing to hear your words about their accountability levels without becoming hostile, you realize that these people have formed this mindset not because of any rationality, but because they just didn't want to think. And that's a truly sick and pathological way to behave and to interface with the world, I think. I mean, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not an accredited philosopher or whatever. But from what I have read, and I've read a lot about it, there's nothing healthy about that. There's nothing remotely sterile about that environment, and there's nothing remotely healthy about that environment. It's all full of, terrible disease that must be festered out if society is going to thrive. But it's everywhere, and there's only a small pocket of people willing to even have somebody like me on a podcast, much less talk to me on the street. So the world is bad, and it's getting worse, and most people don't want to do anything about it. And it's because they were raised to think that it's okay, and they're raising their kids to think that it's okay. And in doing so, this vicious cycle repeats where people aren't thinking about it. This is just the first world I'm speaking of. I'm not even going into the fact that we get the majority of our manufactured goods from places with fake skies, suicide nets, and forests with ropes going into them. I'm not discussing the fact that we have a huge problem with death and destruction and misery and despair from thieves and liars going all across the globe, because that's how we get our oil and our precious metals and our battery lithium. I'm not discussing any of that yet, even though I just vaguely referenced it. So technically, I suppose you could say I am. But I could go into that for a really long time and come out the other end realizing that everything is terrible and getting worse. So all of these conclusions lead me to believe that, and this is sort of why I'm okay with my mindset being that it's bad and getting worse and not likely to change, because if it's not likely to change, it's not likely that me realizing that is going to be an impedance on my ability to actually affect whatever possible change there is. It just means that if it does change, it'll be because there are enough people like the three of us willing to critically analyze these ideas and realize them for what they are, which is the uncomfortable truth that underpins societal relations.
Yeah, I think a lot of people just don't want to deal with it, or they just don't have no concept at all of everything you just talked about. And I was also going to say, I hope that you said you're writing a book, right? So I hope you cover those kind of topics in your book, because
oh yeah, I'm going to cover all those and more.
Yeah, a lot of people need to hear this kind of stuff, because even though it sounds kind of pessimistic, you can't fix a problem unless you know that it's there.
Right. In Dune, one of the people in Dune, I forget exactly what his name was, but he said the first step in avoiding a trap is knowing of its existence. I like that quote a lot. Because once you realize where the problems are, the world becomes less confusing and you're more empowered. I feel powerful. I just got, before this thing, for the audience who wasn't here for the pre-show, I just got done with a 2-hour workout, and I'm going to have another hour of the workout after I get off this stream, and it's over 100 where I am. Most people would not be willing to do that, but I do it every day because I know that I want to have the kind of body that's capable of the revolution. And in doing so, it's uncomfortable and it sucks, but I think it'll be less uncomfortable and less sucky than being thrown into a camp, if they ever decide to do that, or then having the fuck beaten out of me by cops who decide to militarize and not being able to tense my muscles properly to take the punches, or to fight back against these people. I fucking learn to shoot. That's one of the best pieces of advice I can give anybody. Learn to shoot, learn to use your body as a weapon, all of these sorts of things. Because when you start to realize that the world sucks, you get a baseline for it, and you can be empowered to actually change that from its baseline to a positive future. That's the future that we could have. We could have a future of empowered individuals who know exactly how powerful they are. We could have a future of essentially what Nietzsche would call the Übermensch, because I could go on for a while about how everything is essentially meaningless. But beyond that, there's there's the meaning that you can cultivate in your own life by being the best version that you can be of yourself. And that's the version that everybody should aspire to. The version that the state keeps crushed underfoot, because that's the way the state operates. It operates by taking your spine away and making you move on its own accord. It takes away everything that you are and replaces it with what it wants you to be. Slowly and surely, it removes your spirit and makes it seem as though you will be soulless without them. And that's what has to change. We have to realize that we are the power. We are more powerful than them, and we could crush them tomorrow if we wanted to. But that's the real problem. We don't want to. We have to get there.
One of the things that I always think about is how our government is funded by our tax money. So sometimes I just think to myself, well, what if everyone, or even 50% of the population here in America just decided they weren't going to pay their taxes when tax time came?
Right.
And what would they do if 50% of their funding was just completely wiped out because we decided we weren't going to pay them?
Or and like that's one component of refusal. Shout out to my homie C Traffic in Miami. He wrote a song called "What If Nobody Got Up to Vote That Day," and it had like a great fucking amusing thing in there about like how the show's canceled when nobody shows up. When nobody's watching it anymore, the show is canceled. And I like that metaphor. This is a reality show, and the average person, if they realized that this was a thinly veiled attempt at entertainment that was also controlling their minds, they could realize that, hey, maybe Donald Trump was there because he's a puppet, because the elites wanted a reality show host in charge of the single most popular reality show on the planet. And that's the same way with taxation. It's the same way with following the orders of police. If we just said, you know what, I recognize that I was on my phone, but you were also on your massive laptop in there while you were coming to run my information while you were chasing. So if you're going to charge me, I'm going to charge you too, and probably double because you're a public accountability official, theoretically. If everybody started to do these things, these little acts of rebellion, and started to test the waters and see where their freedom actually was, enough to realize that they basically don't have any, there would be a huge amount of change, and relatively immediately.
Oh, you look like you're going to say something.
Oh, no, I was just thinking that too, because, like you were saying, public accountability and, officer or whatever. But then when you see because we're kind of going back to when you're talking about, watching these police brutality videos and how the police there's really hardly, if any, accountability to whenever, something terrible goes wrong because of the police. But then,
well, right. And not even because, like, even if the
Hello?
Eric Garner, these motherfuckers were killed themselves before they could do that damage. That's my bent. I don't care much about accountability if they're fundamentally evil still.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's just I think if they were to have accountability, and I know you're completely, want to get rid of him, but I'm just trying to think of like a yeah,
like a solution that you could implement now.
Yeah, I guess so. But kind of because when you think about it, like you were saying, it's not going to completely just end, overnight. It's going to be a long process for it to completely be way different, because as Dave Smith says in the beginning of his podcast, and even one of his videos, he says, America started as the smallest government in world history, and we've become the biggest government in world history. So that's a really great way of looking at it, because when we started, it was just a group of people with this idea of quote unquote freedom, and
it somehow became the largest
empire in the world.
Then
you see, like, you look at there's a Twitter page that I'm sure you know of. It's like where every single day they'll tweet a new crime that, oh, you need this and this, and one I saw, it seems so ridiculous. It was like you can't tow something I think it was like a boat. I can't remember what it was.
You can't tow a jet ski with a boat without a license.
Yeah, you needed a permit for that. And I'm like, why the fuck would you need a permit to tow a goddamn jet ski? Like, who gives a fuck?
Well, it's money, and you know, it's a similar thing. There's a book written by a couple of British people that I would recommend everybody read. And someday I'd like to share a pint with these people, because they wrote this book called "You Can Get Arrested for That." I can't remember what it was, like the subtitle there, but it's basically these two British guys who were reading a book of insane laws in America, and they started to think like, well, why don't we go over to America and break a bunch of these laws? And they actually got arrested for some really, really dumb shit. Like, for instance, I think it was, you can't go whale hunting in Death Valley or something like that. Or you can't, what was it? You can't, there's this town where you couldn't sleep in a fridge in a hotel room, on top of a fridge. That's what it was. And I can't remember what place that was. This is all off memory, and it's been like years since I read it. But everybody should read the book because it's fucking hilarious, and it had me laughing for a significant portion of the time. Plus, it's just a good little story about a couple of dudes going through America. So it's got its own story arc on its own. And they don't just break laws while they're here. They appreciate a lot of what America has to offer and blah and all that stuff. But they also break a bunch of these dumbass laws. And nobody gets hurt. Nobody even comes close to getting hurt. But they do get arrested, I think, once. And I think they also get charged another time. And it's all for dumb shit. And most people don't recognize it, but most people commit 3 felonies a day. That's an average. It's not like, if you stay indoors all day, you'll commit 3 felonies a day. But there's a decent average to be said there from the average American person committing like 3 felonies a day. And this is a statistic that I've been talking about for nigh on a decade, so it's probably more now. And that's insane. It's fucking nuts that most people don't make victims and they can still have that many so-called crimes committed. It should be an atrocious symbol of how hateful this government has become. But instead, most people don't think of it that way. They don't watch specials like John Stossel's Illegal Everything and think, hey, let's scrap this and not ever do it again. They watch specials like John Stossel's Illegal Everything and they're like, huh, isn't that odd? That sucks. Those laws should go away. Well, like 40 more of them are put on the books. I mean, I said it today on my Twitter. I post these angry little mini rants occasionally, and I have this way of talking that doesn't get a whole lot of traction. But for multiple reasons that I own. I'm not saying like I'm the nicest person and I should be popular, because I'm not and I shouldn't. But my post was how, quote, truth works. I said, a corrupt act is acted out, puppet masters hide it, the media ignores it, time elapses sufficient so that most people forget about it, the few that don't keep digging, and more corruption takes place so that when, quote, truth finally surfaces, it's too late. And that's generally how I think these things happen. You're going to end up with a huge amount more awfulness because most people aren't willing to strike at the root and realize that that root is the institution that they've relied on for X, Y, and Z their whole lives, thinking, well, if we got rid of government, how would we, be there for the kids? How would we keep our communities safe? How would we keep our country safe? How would we do X, Y, and Z, healthcare, education, blah, blah. They don't think that, hey, maybe these things shouldn't be done by these people and we should find other people. They think, how would they? They're not even to the stage of realizing that these people aren't the only ones who can do them. So most people are fundamentally sick. We're probably not going to win. And it's because people aren't responsible for their actions or themselves, much less their ideas and the consequences thereof. But if they are, and if they do realize that this sort of thing needs to fundamentally be scrapped, then we've got some possibility for victory here. And in that spirit, I would say that the first thing I would recommend is form a network in your local community of people who do things instead of using government services, like call cops. No. call your neighbor. Try to get the problem resolved because you know a guy who knows this guy better than you do. Things like that. Little, like, personal ways to deal with these problems. And, you know, that alone would have a huge impact. Form bucket brigades so that the house doesn't burn down before the firefighters get to it. You know, things like that, little things. And if you start to do little things like that, all of these things will be much less likely to be as bad a problem as they are. And it's going to be that little baby step toward liberty that's going to get more and more people interested and more people recognizing, well, hey, if I'm doing all this stuff myself, why do I need the government? Then taxation is theft, then personal responsibility, then anarchy, and suddenly we have a global paradigm shift. But it's going to take a lot of steps in between there to get everybody on those major steps, and it's probably not even going to happen. So my message is start with you, start with your own mind, recognize that you can't just divest your responsibility or divert your responsibilities to other institutions, especially since your primary responsibility is to yourself and to being the best person you can be.
So the book that you were just talking about, getting arrested, or you can get arrested for that. It's by Rich Smith and Lee.
Yes, yeah.
Well, it's his friend that he has traveled with him, but some of the laws that they do that apparently is legal. So one of them is, or I'll read off a few here. It's illegal to ride a bike in a swimming pool in the Los Angeles suburb of Baldwin Park.
Yep.
In Globe, Arizona, it is illegal to play cards against a Native American.
Yep.
Two men, I guess, fishing in their pajamas in Chicago is also illegal, and then drinking beer out of a bucket on a St. Louis sidewalk. And they also have some bullet points here for other ones, such as entering a theater within 3 hours of eating garlic in Indianapolis is illegal. Offering cigarettes or whiskey to zoo animals in New Jersey.
Who would ever do that?
And falling asleep in a cheese factory in South Dakota. Yeah, so yeah, that's, I don't know. I never heard of that book, and that's definitely one that's gonna be in my radar now because I never heard that book. But thank you so much for recommending it.
Yeah, and hey, once my book is done, you can find out how we're all gonna die.
Yeah. So how are we gonna die then?
Well, likely the elites are going to enact one of their many plans to reduce the global population to 500 million or less in what they call perpetual harmony with the earth. And the majority of the population is going to be killed off while they hide in their many bunkers across multiple countries. And they're going to emerge victorious, having all the resources and all the infrastructure that they need to effectively form a new society where they justify all of their actions and make it seem as though their control is justified to a gigantic population of people who've always benefited from it, while the poor and underclass will have been killed off in mass dyings.
Do you think that will happen in our lifetime?
Maybe.
I hope it doesn't.
Well, arm up.
Yeah.
I've heard a few theories about that, but I haven't gotten really deep into it. So.
Well, hey, if you ever want to have me on again, I can go in hard on the conspiracy bullshit, because the basic philosophy shit is something that, you know, can be said in essentially one sentence. You own yourself, act like it. But the rest of it is all insane stuff that it would probably take much longer to talk about. In fact, we're discussing post-collapse crypto anarchy and what to do to prep for that in Shit Shooting Sunday, which is this Sunday on Jeremiah Talks from 6 to 9 p.m. Eastern time. So if y'all wanted to show up for that, you could.
Sounds good to me. So wait, so then would you consider yourself, because I've seen this like circulating on Twitter, like a collapsitarian?
I don't want the collapse to happen, but I have a feeling it's going to. I'm not necessarily a collapsitarian. I consider myself more of a Chaos Emerald collector. I'm fine if it does happen, but I'm going to try and fight the badniks anyway.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I've seen some people saying, like, we can't change until there's a collapse. So.
Well, that's likely what's going to happen. I'm just not going to revel in that possibility. My general reveling is in the idea that maybe people are redeemable, because I'd love to be proven wrong about how much of a dirty pessimist I am.
So some more rules that they're
still into that book.
I don't know, this is so interesting to me. But apparently it's illegal to kiss someone for longer than 5 minutes at a time in Kansas. You can't peel oranges in hotel rooms in California, so have fun with that.
Yeah, along with the straws, you know.
Yeah. Banning of straws is just, I mean, come on now. But
well, of course they didn't ban them. They just made it so that people can't offer them unsolicited. You have to ask for a straw now, where the person handing them to you will get, and this is like only in Santa Barbara too, which is another part of the misconception. It's not statewide, but like in generally speaking, they've also reviewed and revised the law because they found out how absurd it made them look. So the memes worked, but essentially, they're not banning them. They just made it so that, you know, you can't just give them out. It's an environmental bullshit, but it's environmental bullshit. It's not actually there to preserve the environment. It's there to generate revenue, which is why that's primarily what it's going to do. They're not going to fucking jail people. The prisons are overcrowded, and they're not like massively ramping up the contracts in California for building new ones. That hasn't taken a spike. The prison industrial complex is largely an Arizonan thing right now. So there's that part of, and you know, obviously you know why. But there's that part of it. But like the other part of it is that if they don't jail them, well, then there's the obvious other thing, which is like thousands of dollars per day from these people. And likely businesses would start to do things like insulate their workers from it, because they wouldn't want their workers to quit. So they would probably start doing things like, we'll pay your fines if that does happen. So like Country Time paying lemonade stand fines for kids that were like threatened with arrest for their fucking lemonade stands. Yeah. So it's sort of like that, you know, the businesses will probably start to try and absorb that cost. And the more that happens, the more revenue the state gets to collect passively, and the more interest appears to be being paid off on these terrible loans used to create the dollar in the first place, which is a subject that I could probably go on for days. But anyway, go ahead with the fucking bullshit laws.
Oh, no, that was pretty much all it was in there, because I was looking at the Amazon description, but...
Yeah, read the book. I originally checked it out from a public library when I was still in high school.
Yeah.
It's really cheap on Amazon now. It's like $4.
Yeah.
So everyone should buy it.
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying before with that, you know, that Twitter handle, that this every single day that, you know, they tweet out a new law, or not a new law, but, you know, a law that's in the books. Yeah, a crime a day. It just makes you realize just how thick that book has to be. It has to be at least like, you know, 10 stories high or something.
Didn't they say they wouldn't be done tweeting it out? If they tweeted one per day, it would take until like 2080.
And that's with current.
I think it was like after my, I don't know, like great grandchildren or something like that. It's ridiculous how long it would take.
Well, and that's the thing. Like, they have laws that they could never possibly have the time or the resources to enforce. They have money that's a debt creation system that they could never possibly have the time, resources, or manpower to pay back. And they have all of these things so that they can perpetually keep on using us as cattle to keep their pockets swelling. And that's what I oppose. I oppose these blood-handed people who won't stop bloodying their own hands.
Yeah, it just kind of reminds me of all the fees that you have to pay, that where you're like, I don't know why I have to pay a fee for this. Like, I don't know, like a marriage license.
Well, if it's revenue generation, and if it helps the people who run the regulatory boards for alimony and child protection and shit, then that makes sense. But it makes sense because people are still wedded primarily to the state, and they can't just love and be in a loving relationship with one another without having a bunch of protections in it, so that, you know, it's essentially like making a business arrangement and not like an expression of love at all.
Yeah, that's why I can understand where the collapsitarians, or whatever you want to call them, I get where they come from, because, you know, at this point, it just seems like, well,
there's no going back.
Yeah, it's like, what else can you do? Because, you know, if we're
well,
go back,
you can spread the word.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. You have to be willing to talk. You have to be willing to sound like a Nazi or a communist or whatever somebody wants to call you. And you have to be firm and steadfast and unyielding, but also humble. And these are traits that a lot of people have not learned to develop because they've learned to be milquetoast centrist and compromising. And that's what has to stop.
Yeah. So I mean, we're about going over an hour, and you can go ahead and end it.
Yeah.
And
then you can get your hour workout.
Yeah, you can start your hour workout. But yeah, Jeremiah, thank you so much for joining us. It was really awesome to hear you talk and to hear what you have to say.
I know my mind's kind of blown right now.
Yeah, I'm always glad that we can have people that is able to kind of
bring a new perspective.
Yeah, and elaborate on what they have to say. So again, thank you so much for joining us.
We'll have to have you.
Yeah, for sure.
No problem. And if you ever want to start discussing economics or conspiracies, I'm down for that too.
Sweet.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. So again, thank you so much, Jeremiah, and to everyone that's watching, and to everyone that will be watching. Thank you again, and thanks for your support. And we'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye bye.